like to discuss a paper written by Enric Frago and his associates in regards to the importance of insect symbionts and their role in plant-insect interactions. In the discussion, we will touch on how mutualisms may affect host plant range and allow insects to have advantages that they would not have on their own. We will also discuss the complex interactions between the symbiont with their host and the effect on host and plant fitness. It's common knowledge that plants are very low-quality food. Associations between insects and facultative symbionts can be important factors in the overall interactions between plants and insects. In some cases, the symbionts are obligate and are more like organelles than they are pre-existing creatures. However, there are several examples of facultative symbionts that are not necessary for survival, but can be found in a small portion of the population and drastically change the organism's phenotype and fitness. In the figure showed, we'll see how symbionts can both directly and indirectly influence insect-plant interactions. In part A, we see insect symbionts directly influencing host plant use in herbivorous insects, but also we can see indirect changes to plant state or physiology, which will also be a benefit to the host. Such changes can affect other insects sharing the same host plant. Insect symbionts can directly affect the host's interactions with natural enemies, such as the ladybug there, but also indirectly through changes in plant physiology and the emission of herbivore-induced plant volatiles. Insect symbionts can colonize plants, which is a likely route for horizontal transmission, which we'll discuss later. Similarly, plant pathogens can be vectored by insects and may evolve into mutualisms if the insect benefits from the disease host plant, which happens quite often in cases such as bark beetles and pine jack trees. Different insect symbionts can differently affect host insects and host plant use by ultimately uh, mediating the interactions between different insects. Communities of insect symbionts, including such things as bacteria, fungi, viruses, are found both in insects and plants where they can engage in very complex interactions, which will also be discussed later in our discussion. When an herbivore consumes a portion of a plant, it will induce various defenses that will directly affect the ability of the insect to consume the plant material. There is growing evidence that insect-associated microorganisms might benefit their host by mitigating the plant's response to their host attacks. For example, these beetles on the slide are common pests of maize and are most notorious for having a mutualism with the microorganism Wolbachia. This Wolbachia can offer a genetic advantage to help the beetle, which is in this case the western corn rootworm, overcome the large defense mechanism of the plant. Even though most microorganisms are transmitted vertically from generation to generation, there are some examples of horizontal transfer. The simplest example of this is through a common passive surface between adults and juveniles. In the case presented here, the stink bug nymphs must eat the bacterial capsules left behind by their parents in order to obtain the necessary symbionts for optimal fitness. If horizontal transmission is influenced by plant species and if the symbiont influence insect fitness, this three-way interaction could affect selection for host plant specialization and the population's preference on food plants. When we think of a pathogen, we don't really think of it being a mutualist in any way. However, in some cases, we can see that these microorganisms that are pathogens to plants are often mutualists of the host insect, and these insects can be used as vectors for the pathogen to get into the plant. Many insects can have mutualisms with pathogens, such as this white fly. The white fly will eat the plant that it has landed on and pass the disease into the plant, As the plant begins to decay from the pathogen, it becomes a higher quality food source for the white fly, therefore increasing the fitness of the fly. Food webs are a fundamental visual for most ecologists. However, new data of symbionts can influence the interactions between the organisms and the community as a whole. For example, an entire food web based on a tree can be determined on whether or not it's affected by an endophytic fungus or a soil-borne microorganism. In a lot of ways, the symbionts can affect uh, their host by allowing the tree to be more edible and have less defenses if it's present, but this same effect can also indirectly affect the host's competition by decreasing the food quality for that given species. Symbionts can influence the interactions between its host and their natural enemies. This is most commonly studied in pea aphids. Depending on the bacteria interacting with the aphid, the host either has a higher resistance to parasitoids or a fungal pathogen that's commonly found near pea populations. In order to resist the parasitoid, the symbiont changes the color of the aphid, leading to a greatly decreased attack rate. Multiple infections of symbionts in the same insect host are relatively common and can lead to complex community interactions within the organism itself. This can have pretty important consequences for the plant because, like inside of this glassy-winged sharpshooter, depending on which symbiont it inhibits, it can either be beneficial to the insect and very, very bad for the plant, or kind of have a negating effect between the insect and the plant. Complex interaction among insect symbionts can also occur between microorganisms that are as distant as fungus and bacteria. Another example, the southern pine beetle has two fungal associates, one that digests wood for developing larvae and another, O-, that is thought to involve in combating tree defenses during the initial colonization. Once the beetle has become established, O- ceases to be beneficial to the insect because it competes with the other fungus. It has been found that yet another beetle symbiont, a bacteria, produces an antibiotic that will inhibit this O- growth. So depending on what is outcompeted inside of the host insect, it will have drastically different outcomes for the plant. Of course, going forward, the authors realize that there are several challenges to their upcoming research that need to be prioritized in order to get a better understanding of symbiont interactions as a whole. A couple of them I've listed here. The first is going to be obtaining a greater understanding of the symbionts inside of the host insect and their interactions as a whole. The next is discovering new routes and mechanisms that symbionts will have in order to get to insects and plants, or in between, either or. The next is understanding how facultative symbionts are transmitted horizontally. Even though we have some pretty clear and obvious examples, the mechanism of horizontally transmitted symbionts is still pretty fuzzy. Another is understanding how symbionts affect host competitors. And the last, understanding why the creation of novel symbiosis can affect the importance of the insect host as a pest. Just a couple of concluding remarks before we end this talk. Aphids, because of how intensely they've been studied, have a great capacity to protect themselves from their environments due to their facultative symbionts, and we have a pretty good understanding from these studies of how the interactions between the symbionts and the aphids plays a role in the community interactions as a whole. In aphids, as well as several other players, we are finding unexpected influences of symbiotic microorganisms that can be much more complex than just one symbiont in one organism. The indirect effects still have a lot to be studied. An increase in our understanding of the role of symbionts has been made possible by many advances in molecular biology, and as molecular biology becomes more understood and easier to understand throughout different studies and practices, we'll likely see an increase in understanding of the mechanisms between symbionts and their hosts, And finally, we're going to see how insect mutualists interact with plants is potentially a pretty major applied significance to the fundamental interactions of communities as a whole. That's going to be the end of my discussion. I want to thank you guys for lending me your ears, and hopefully this leads to a better understanding of symbionts and their interactions with their hosts.